He never spoke. Not a word, not a sound, not even a whisper. A boy so quiet that people believed he was broken, cursed, or perhaps simply empty inside. His silence made him invisible, a shadow passing through the noise of the world. And yet, what they didn't know was that behind that silence was something the world would never forget. From the very beginning, the boy's presence was unsettling to many. Children avoided him, whispering cruel jokes. Adults shook their heads, pitying him or dismissing him as useless. In a world where every child was expected to laugh, shout, and chatter, his refusal, or inability to speak, set him apart like a stranger in his own home. But his silence was not weakness. It was not emptiness. It was a shield. Beneath the quiet exterior lived a mind watching, listening, and learning. He absorbed every detail others overlooked. The flicker of anger in a man's eyes, the hesitation in a woman's smile, the secrets whispered when no one thought he was listening. Silence gave him power, and so while the world dismissed him, the boy built a world of his own within. His hands, his eyes, and his heart began to speak where his mouth would not. The silence, once seen as a curse, would soon reveal itself as something else entirely. The source of a gift that would shock everyone who had ever mocked, doubted, or ignored him. The audience is left wondering, what is this boy hiding? Why is his silence so powerful? What secret is waiting to be revealed? Sometimes silence is not emptiness. Sometimes it is the loudest voice of all. The boy's school days were a mirror of his life, filled with noise all around him, yet silence within him. Every morning he would walk through the gates quietly, books pressed tightly against his chest as if they were a shield. He never ran with the other children. He never shouted greetings or laughed at morning jokes. Instead, he slipped into the classroom like a shadow and sat in the farthest corner, where no one paid much attention, or so he wished. But children notice those who are different. They whispered when he walked past, "Here comes the mute boy. He's so weird, bet he can't even say his own name." Some laughed loudly enough for him to hear, hoping to get a reaction. Others mocked him by mimicking silence, exaggerating gestures or covering their mouths and shaking their heads like he did. He never responded. He only lowered his gaze, opened his notebook, and let the storm of ridicule pass. Yet, if anyone had dared to look into his eyes, they would have seen something unsettling. Depth. His eyes didn't flicker with fear nor with anger. They carried weight, like the eyes of someone far older than his years. It was as though he knew something they didn't, as though his silence contained answers none of them could understand. Teachers didn't quite know what to do with him. Some felt pity. They thought he was broken, a poor child locked in his own world. They gave him easier tasks, avoided asking him to recite, and sometimes spoke to him in tones one might use with a much younger child. But others grew frustrated. "Why don't you speak? Are you ignoring me?" One teacher scolded when he failed to respond aloud to a question. His silence was interpreted as defiance, and punishments followed, standing outside the classroom, being made to copy pages over and over, all because his mouth refused to form words. The boy bore it all in silence. He never fought back, never tried to explain. Perhaps he couldn't, perhaps he wouldn't. Only he knew the truth. But silence, though misunderstood, became his greatest weapon. When the class solved math problems, the boy didn't just solve them. He finished faster than most. When experiments were shown in science, his eyes caught details no one else noticed. In history, while others doodled in their books, he studied every map and date with sharp attention. His hands, steady and precise, drew shapes and notes so meticulous they looked almost printed. Some classmates began to feel uneasy. "He's not normal," they whispered. "He's too quiet, too different." And yet jealousy simmered in their voices, for while they wasted time mocking, the boy seemed to be absorbing everything like a sponge. Still, the world saw only his silence. His achievements were overlooked, his intelligence hidden beneath the assumption that a boy who did not speak must not matter. Lunchtime was the hardest. While others crowded into groups, laughing and swapping food, he sat alone on a bench in the corner of the yard. Sometimes he didn't even eat, staring instead at the clouds drifting across the sky. A few children would approach, not with kindness but cruelty. "Hey, mute boy, want my sandwich?" One would taunt, tossing bread at him. Another added, "Say something and I'll give you this apple." He never reached for the food. He never begged. He simply let it fall to the ground, brushed it away, and returned to his silent watch of the sky. This only made them angrier. His refusal to react was, in its own way, a form of defiance, though he never intended it as such. They thought he was weak. They thought his silence meant fear, but they had no idea what lived inside him. For sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who sees everything the loudest never notice. One day, during a class test, something remarkable happened. The teacher handed out papers, and while most students scribbled anxiously, the boy calmly filled every answer with quiet precision. When the results returned, he had scored the highest mark, not just in the class, but in the entire grade. The room buzzed with confusion. How could the mute boy beat us? He must have cheated. There's no way he's smarter than me. But no cheating was found. The truth was undeniable. His silence had not hindered him. It had sharpened him. Still, instead of admiration, the jealousy only grew. His classmates mocked him harder, whispering behind his back, hurling insults louder. They couldn't accept that the boy they thought broken could outshine them all. The boy, however, never let it show. Each insult became another stone in the wall of his silence. Each punishment became another layer of patience. Each lonely day became another page in the book of endurance he was writing silently within himself. And slowly, without anyone realizing it, that silence was transforming into something extraordinary. Because while the world underestimated him, he was quietly building something that would one day shake that same world to its core. School should have been a place of learning, of laughter, of friendships made in the innocence of childhood. But for him, it was a battlefield, and he was always the unarmed soldier. Every day brought new wounds, not of fists and kicks alone, but of words sharper than any blade. At lunch, the cruelty was ritual. He would quietly open his small tin box, often filled with the simplest of meals, a piece of bread, perhaps a cold potato, sometimes nothing at all. The moment he placed it on the desk, hands would reach across and snatch it away. "Thanks, mute boy," a classmate would sneer, biting into his bread. Another would laugh. "Oh, he doesn't need food. He doesn't even use his mouth." The classroom erupted in laughter, and though his stomach ached with hunger, the boy remained still, staring down at the desk as if the grain of the wood could protect him. His silence, which was his only shield, was seen as weakness. But silence has a cost. By refusing to retaliate, he became the easiest target. They learned quickly that no matter what they did, he would not scream, would not fight, would not run to the teachers. To them, he wasn't a classmate. He was a canvas on which to paint their cruelty. Sometimes they would take his pencils and break them in half. Other times they scribbled mock drawings of him on the board, a stick figure with no mouth captioned, "The boy who can't speak." Teachers saw the bullying, but few intervened. Some dismissed it as children being children. Others, though they pitied him, quietly agreed with the parents who whispered at meetings, "He's not like the other kids. There's something wrong with him. Why keep him in a normal school? He's too different." The weight of those words was heavier than stones, for when even adults began to see him as an outsider, the children grew bolder. One afternoon on the playground, a group of boys cornered him near the fence. "Say something," one demanded. "Come on, just one word." Another teased. He said nothing, as always. Frustrated, they shoved him. His small body hit the fence and his books scattered onto the dirt. They laughed louder. "Look at him. He won't even fight back. Coward. Freak." The teacher on duty glanced over but did not move. The boy picked up his book slowly, brushing the dust off the pages, and walked away as if the laughter did not exist. But inside, his heart throbbed with pain. Another day in class. A note passed from desk to desk reached the teacher's hands. She opened it and frowned. It was a cruel caricature of him, drawn by a student. A boy with a giant head and no mouth, surrounded by words like useless, broken, mistake. The class snickered. The teacher sighed and tore the paper but gave no punishment. "Let's continue," she said. Pretending not to notice the tears, the boy blinked away as he buried his face in his notebook. At home, the whispers continued. His guardians, relatives who had reluctantly taken him in after his parents were gone, treated him with cold detachment. He just sits there, never speaks, never plays with the other children, they muttered to neighbors. "He makes people uncomfortable. Sometimes I wonder if keeping him here is worth it." He heard every word. Silence didn't blot the peace, but absence. He ate alone in a corner while the rest of the family chatted at the table. His plate was always smaller, his portion meager. They thought he didn't notice, but he did. And so, night after night, when loneliness wrapped around him tighter than any blanket, he sought refuge in the only companions that never mocked him: his pencils, his scraps of paper, his secret world of art. When the house slept, he lit a small candle by his bedside and opened the worn notebook he had hidden beneath the floorboard. Page after page, he filled it with drawings. He drew the playground bullies, but not as they were, as exaggerated, monstrous figures, their laughter twisted into grotesque grins. He drew the teachers, tall and looming, blindfolded so they could not see the truth. He drew himself, small but standing firm, his silence like a shield glowing with light. Art became his language. Every line, every stroke carried the words his mouth could not speak. His hands poured out everything his heart held: the pain, the anger, the hope. But drawing was not his only escape. On nights when he had no paper, he would hum softly to himself, melodies so fragile they barely touched the air. Music flowed from him like whispers from the soul, notes that spoke the words he kept locked away. No one knew. No one cared enough to listen. But in that solitude, his silence transformed into something extraordinary. His lunch was stolen, his voice mocked, his very existence questioned. And all because he chose silence, a silence they could not understand. He endured more than most grown men could bear. But while the world saw weakness, he was quietly shaping strength. For within his silence lived a gift waiting to be revealed, a gift that would one day silence the very voices that mocked him. The next morning at school, he once again walked in quietly. The same corner desk, the same teasing whispers, yet none of them knew that in his small notebook hidden in his bag lay worlds they could not imagine. None of them knew that while they laughed at his silence, he was building a voice louder than any of theirs. They believed they had broken him, but in truth, they were only sharpening the blade of his destiny. The pain of bullying defined his childhood, but it also forced him into the refuge of his hidden talents. The audience now not only feels sympathy, but also anticipation. They stole his food. They stole his peace. They tried to steal his dignity. But what they could not steal was the gift his silence had been guarding all along. And soon the world would see what he had kept hidden. The world had labeled him as nothing, a silent boy, an outsider, a shadow in the corner of every room. But even shadows hold secrets, and his silence was not emptiness. It was a vessel carrying something extraordinary. And one day the world almost saw it. It began like any other morning. He walked to school with slow steps, his head lowered, carrying his worn satchel. Inside, hidden among textbooks, lay the secret notebook he treasured, the one filled with sketches he never showed anyone. He slipped into his usual seat at the back, where no one cared to look. The class buzzed with chatter, jokes, and laughter, the noise of belonging, from which he was always excluded. The teacher entered, scolding the children into silence, and began writing equations across the blackboard. Mathematics was a subject that made most students groan, but for him it was like breathing. Numbers formed patterns in his mind, dancing into place effortlessly. He saw answers before the questions had even finished. And that day, fate played its hand. Whoever solves this problem without error will earn the top score for the week. She wrote a complex equation across the board, symbols and fractions that made the students shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Anyone?" she asked, waiting. A few tried, fumbling with chalk, only to return defeated. Laughter filled the room at each failure. No one dared step up again. That was when her eyes, perhaps by chance, landed on him, the silent boy in the corner. "You," she said, surprising even herself. "Try it," the class erupted. "Him? He can't even talk." "What's he going to do, stare at the numbers?" He froze, his heart pounded. The last thing he ever wanted was attention. Yet slowly, almost unwillingly, he stood and walked toward the board. The chalk felt strange in his fingers. The classroom eyes burned into his back. For a moment he wanted to run, but then the numbers swirled in his mind, fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. His hand began to move. He wrote quickly, confidently, each line precise. The classroom grew quiet. Whispering died. Even the bullies leaned forward, curiosity replacing mockery. In less than a minute, the problem was solved. Neatly, flawlessly. He placed the chalk down and stepped aside. The teacher's jaw slackened. She checked the solution twice, then 3 times. It was correct, perfect. A hush fell over the room. For the first time, his silence wasn't seen as weakness. It was power. His intelligence spoke louder than any voice could have. The teacher whispered almost to herself, "Incredible." And in that fragile moment, the world glimpsed who he really was. But fate wasn't done yet. Later that week in art class, another accident occurred. He usually kept his drawings hidden, sketching only when no one was near. But as the bell rang, he forgot to tuck the notebook back into his bag. It slid to the floor. A curious hand snatched it up. "What's this?" One of the bullies sneered, flipping through the pages. But the sneer faded as his eyes widened. Inside were portraits so lifelike they seemed ready to breathe. The curve of a smile, the sorrow in an eye, the texture of hair captured with astonishing detail. There were landscapes, too, worlds more beautiful than anything they had seen in their small town. Soon the whole class crowded around, stunned into silence. Did he really draw these?" One whispered. "No way. It looks like a photograph." The teacher, drawn by the commotion, took the notebook and flipped through the sketches. Her expression softened. "These are extraordinary." For a moment, the boy wanted to vanish. His secret world had been exposed, his heart laid bare. But in that exposure, something magical happened. Respect. The same children who mocked him stood in awe. The teacher looked at him differently, no longer with pity but with admiration. In that instant, the boy's silence transformed. It was no longer a barrier but a mystery, for though he had no words, his hands spoke volumes, through numbers, through art, through the language of brilliance hidden in shadows. But just as quickly as the spark appeared, it faded. The bullies, embarrassed at their awe, masked it with laughter. "Okay, so he can draw. Big deal. Still a mute freak." The teacher, afraid of favoritism, closed the notebook and returned it to him, saying nothing more. Life resumed its cruel rhythm. The glimpse of his talent flickered, then disappeared back into silence. That night, under the dim light of his candle, he replayed the day in his mind. The way their eyes had widened, the hush that had filled the classroom, it was proof. Proof that his silence wasn't emptiness, but power waiting to be seen. He whispered to himself, not with words, but with strokes of his pencil. One day, they will know. They saw a spark just for a moment, but destiny had only begun its work. For what he carried inside was not meant to be hidden forever, and when it finally came to light, it would silence the world itself. The audience is left with tension. They've seen the boy's brilliance, his sketches, his mastery of numbers, but also the fragility of recognition, how quickly it slipped away. He returned to being invisible. But now the viewers know a truth the villagers don't. He isn't broken. He is extraordinary. And sooner or later, that gift will force the world to see him. The world had seen glimpses of his hidden brilliance in the sketches, the numbers, the spark that briefly flickered before vanishing into silence. But life has a way of testing greatness before it is revealed. And for him, the test came as cruelty sharper than any blade. This was the day he reached the breaking point. It began on a bright morning, the kind that seemed ordinary to everyone except him. The school courtyard was alive with chatter. Teachers prepared for the upcoming event, a small talent day, where students were encouraged to showcase their abilities before the whole school. For weeks, posters had been plastered on the walls. Music, dance, art, poetry, show the best of yourself. The students buzzed with excitement, rehearsing lines, polishing instruments, practicing dance steps. But in the corner, the silent boy sat with his notebook clutched tightly against his chest. He had no intention of performing. How could he? To speak in front of the crowd was impossible. To show his art, his music, or his skill meant exposing the very heart he kept hidden. So, as always, he planned to fade into the background. But fate had other plans. Among the students were those who loved tormenting him, the same bullies who stole his lunch, mocked his silence, and turned his difference into a spectacle. And on talent day, they saw an opportunity. "Hey," one whispered, smirking, "let's put him on stage. Let's see the mute boy perform." Laughter erupted. "What's he gonna do, stand there? That'll be the best joke of the day." The plan was set. They whispered to teachers that he had prepared something special, convincing them to add his name to the list of performers. He didn't know until it was too late. The gymnasium was packed. Students, parents, and teachers filled the seats, cheering as acts came and went. A boy played violin, a girl recited poetry, a group performed a lively dance. Applause echoed after each act, the microphone smiling the moment. And now, we have a special performance from someone you might not expect. Please welcome our quiet classmate. The spotlight turned. His name rang across the hall. The silent boy froze in his seat, his stomach twisting. He shook his head, but hands were already pushing him forward. The bullies grinned, waiting for the show. Not of talent, but of humiliation. Every step to the stage felt like walking through fire. His palms sweated. His breath caught in his chest. The crowd clapped politely, expecting something. He stood in the center, blinded by the lights. Silence stretched. The teacher whispered, "Go ahead, you can start." But he had nothing prepared. His throat locked. Words would not come. He stared at the floor, frozen. Then came the first laugh, a chuckle in the crowd, followed by another, and another. Soon the gymnasium rippled with cruel laughter echoing off the walls. "Mute boy, say something." "He can't." The sound pierced deeper than any wound. His body trembled. His vision blurred, the laughter swelled, thunderous, merciless. And in that moment something inside him broke. Not his will, but the chains that had bound him. He clutched his notebook, the one he carried everywhere, and for the first time, he opened it before the world. His hands shook, but his movements were deliberate. He flipped through page after page, sketches of faces, places, emotions so vivid that the crowd gasped. The bullies who had mocked him fell silent. The parents leaned forward. The teacher's eyes widened. He tore out one page, a portrait of the school itself drawn in exquisite detail, every brick and window captured with precision. Another page, a sketch of his classmates not as bullies but as laughing friends, their joy immortalized on paper. Each page was a piece of his soul, exposed at last. The laughter died. The gymnasium was silent, but not with mockery. With awe, the teacher approached, her voice trembling. You drew these?" He nodded barely. His silence spoke louder than words. Gasps echoed. The audience had expected failure, emptiness. Instead, they had been given brilliance. The kind of brilliance that could not be ignored. But before admiration could fully bloom, the moment shattered. One of the bullies, red with anger at being silenced by the very boy they mocked, grabbed a drawing and ripped it in half. The sound of tearing paper echoed like a scream. The boy's chest clenched. His art, his only voice, and destroyed before everyone. The crowd gasped. Teachers shouted. But he didn't move. He stood frozen, staring at the shredded pieces drifting to the floor, and inside him the breaking point turned into fire. His hands clenched into fists. For the first time, his silence wasn't just painful. It was dangerous. He felt the urge to speak, to shout, to release everything he had swallowed for years. The audience watched, breathless. Would he cry? Would he run? Or would he finally speak? They had mocked his silence, broken his art, and tried to shatter his spirit. But they did not know. The fire inside him was no longer hidden. The breaking point had come, and the world was about to change. The scene closes with the boy standing on the stage, trembling but unbroken. His eyes blaze with something the audience has never seen before, defiance. The bullies step back, uneasy. Teachers rush to his side. The crowd waits, hearts pounding. He had remained silent for so long, but silence has its limits. The question now was no longer whether he could speak, but what would happen when he finally did. For years, he had been the boy of silence, a shadow in the corner, a target for laughter, a ghost among the living. But silence can only hold back greatness for so long. And on this day, when his art was torn, when his dignity was mocked before the entire school, something irreversible happened. The fire that had burned quietly within him finally roared to life. The torn pages floated to the ground like fallen feathers, fragments of his soul scattered for everyone to see. Gasps echoed. Teachers scolded the bully. Parents whispered, unsure of what they had just witnessed. But in the middle of the chaos, the boy stood still, his hands trembling, his eyes fixed on the torn art. For the first time, he did not retreat. He did not lower his head. Instead, he bent down, picked up the fragments, and walked back to the center of the stage. The audience fell silent. They had expected him to run, to cry, to vanish as always. But something about his movements was different now. Steady, certain. It was the silence before a storm. He clutched the torn sketch in his hand. His throat tightened. For years, words had been his prison, stuck inside him unspoken. And yet, as he stared at the crowd, he realized something. He didn't need words. His voice had always existed, just in another form. He reached into his bag and pulled out the small notebook he carried everywhere. This time he did not hide it. He held it high. The pages flipped open, revealing drawing after drawing, while portraits, landscapes, visions of a world more beautiful than the one he lived in. The audience gasped again. He stepped to the microphone. His lips parted, but still no words came. Instead, he placed the torn sketch on the stand, and with a piece of charcoal from his pocket, he began to draw. In front of hundreds of eyes, his hand moved like lightning. Lines became shapes. Shapes became life. Within minutes, he had drawn a portrait of the very bully who had mocked him, not with cruelty, but with surprising depth. The boy's face was captured perfectly. Every shadow, every curve, every flicker of expression. The real bully stood frozen, his mouth open as if seeing himself for the first time. Then, the silent boy turned the page. Next, he drew the teacher. Tired eyes, gentle smile, the weight of responsibility captured in each stroke. The teacher pressed her hand to her mouth, tears forming. He turned again, the students, the parents, the gymnasium itself. His art poured onto the pages like water breaking through a dam. The audience watched in stunned silence as he revealed, piece by piece, what he had been hiding all along. A world seen through eyes sharper and more compassionate than anyone had realized. Whispers began to ripple through the room. Is he really doing this live? I've never seen anything like it. He's a genius. The parents who once looked at him with pity now stared with admiration. The classmates who called him Mute Boy now sat frozen, their laughter buried under shame. Even the bullies lowered their heads, unable to meet his gaze, and still he drew. With each stroke, the weight of years of silence fell away. His hand was not just sketching lines, it was speaking, shouting, crying, and singing all at once. For the first time in his life, the world listened. At last, he stopped. He stood before a giant sheet filled with images, the school, the people, the moments of pain and beauty interwoven into a single masterpiece. The crowd held its breath. Then, slowly, he turned and looked at them all. His chest rose and fell. His lips trembled. And in the deepest silence of the night, he whispered the first word they had ever heard him say. See? It was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like thunder. The audience gasped, some with tears streaming down their faces. In that single word, he had given voice to years of suffering, resilience, and hidden greatness. The gymnasium erupted, not with laughter, but with applause so loud it shook the walls. Parents rose to their feet. Teachers clapped through tears. Students stared in awe, their hands coming together almost unwillingly, drawn by the force of what they had just witnessed. The boy who was mocked as silent, broken, invisible, had revealed himself as extraordinary. The bullies shrank in their seats, unable to look at him. They had tried to humiliate him, but instead, they had delivered him to the very stage where he became unforgettable. The principal stepped forward, eyes red with emotion. All these years, she whispered. We thought you were silent because you had nothing to say. But you've been telling us more than words ever could. The art teacher approached, trembling. This isn't talent. It's brilliance. A gift the world must see. The boy stood still, clutching his notebook. For once, he did not feel small. He did not feel invisible. He felt seen. The performance spread through whispers and stories long after that day. Parents told neighbors. Teachers spoke with pride. The silent boy, once mocked and overlooked, was now the center of awe. For him, it wasn't just about recognition. It was about freedom. He no longer carried his art in hiding. He no longer carried his silence as a curse. That day, he realized that being different was never his weakness. It was his power. They thought his silence was emptiness, but silence had been his preparation. When the time came, he didn't just speak, he revealed a voice greater than words. And in that moment, the boy they mocked became unforgettable. The scene fades with the boy walking off stage. His notebook clutched tightly, his head no longer bowed. The crowd still cheers, the applause ringing in his ears. This was only the beginning. The revelation had come. but the world had yet to see just how far his gift would take him. The gymnasium lights had long dimmed. The scattered applause had faded into the night. Yet the echo of that moment, the boy's revelation, lingered in every corner of the school, in every heart that had witnessed it. The silent boy was silent no more, not because he suddenly spoke like everyone else, but because his silence had been redefined. He was no longer mute. He was no longer weird. He was no longer the boy to laugh at. He was the boy who had revealed something extraordinary. The very next morning, everything felt different. He walked into the classroom quietly, as he always did, notebook pressed to his chest. For years, his arrival had gone unnoticed, or worse, mocked with whispers and cruel nicknames, but this time, the room grew still. Some students looked away in shame, their cheeks burning with the memory of how they used to treat him. Others gazed at him with awe, whispering, "That's him, the artist, the boy who drew everything." Even the teacher, who once sighed in frustration at his silence, greeted him differently, gently with respect. "Good morning," she said, her voice trembling with warmth. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of recognition. He was not invisible anymore. The classmates who once stole his lunch now offered him a seat at their table. The boys who mocked him as mute now stammered when they tried to speak to him. Even the bullies who ripped his notebook dared not look him in the eye. It wasn't just guilt, it was awe, because deep down, every child knew the truth. They had ridiculed someone whose greatness they could never reach. His art began to spread. Teachers asked him to draw for school events. His sketches were pinned to the classroom walls, framed in the principal's office, even shown to visitors. Soon the whispers reached beyond the school. Parents talked at dinner tables. Neighbors stopped him on the street. Some would crouch down and say with softened eyes, "You're the boy who can draw like magic, aren't you?" For years he had walked with his head lowered. Now strangers bent their heads to see him. But perhaps the most powerful transformation wasn't in him. It was in those around him. The bullies, who once fed on his silence, now lived in silence themselves. Their laughter had been stolen, their power reversed. In the hallways they stepped aside when he passed. They whispered apologies that their pride would not let them say out loud. It was not revenge. He didn't gloat. He didn't mock them back. He simply walked on, his notebook clutched gently as if reminding them, "This was who I was all along. You just refused to see it." The boy himself began to transform. He no longer hid his notebook. He carried it openly, pages fluttering in the breeze as if daring the world to look. In class he raised his hand, not to speak, but to show. When asked a question, he'd flip his notebook around, solving a problem through diagrams, expressing thoughts through sketches. His silence no longer felt like emptiness. It was a different language, and people finally learned to listen. The boy who once trembled under attention now stood firmly, quietly radiant in his confidence. One day, the principal called him into her office. On the desk lay a stack of his sketches, portraits of classmates, teachers, even the school itself. She looked at him with eyes filled with both regret and pride. "You've taught us something no book ever could," she said. "That greatness doesn't always come in the form we expect. We failed to see you for who you were, but you opened our eyes." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "From this day, you are not just a student of this school. You are its pride." He said nothing, only smiled faintly. But his silence spoke more than words ever could. The school soon invited him to represent them in competitions. At art fairs, his work stunned judges into disbelief. At community gatherings, his portraits drew lines of people eager to see themselves through his eyes. He became, in his own way, a leader. Not through speeches or loud commands, but through a gift that reached deeper than sound. The boy who was once excluded from games, ignored in discussions and mocked in crowds, was now the center, not by force, but by the sheer gravity of his gift. His reputation grew beyond the town. A local newspaper ran a story. "The silent boy who speaks through art." Soon visitors came from other schools, even nearby cities, to meet him. He had lived for so long in the prison of invisibility. Now the world itself leaned in to see him. But the greatest transformation was not in what others saw. It was in what he felt. For the first time, he no longer hated his silence. He embraced it. His quietness was not a weakness. It was the soil in which his art had grown. He realized that while words had been denied to him, another language had been gifted. one that reached where words could never go, the heart. And with that realization came peace. One afternoon, as he sketched under the old tree by the schoolyard, a group of students gathered. They weren't mocking him this time. They watched in awe. "Can you draw me?" one whispered. "Me too," another pleaded. He nodded softly, his hand moving gracefully across the page. When he handed them their portraits, their eyes lit up with wonder. For a moment, the same children who once tormented him felt gratitude, even admiration. And in their eyes he saw something new. Respect. They once called him broken. They once called him strange. But now the boy they mocked was the boy they celebrated. His silence had not destroyed him, and it had built him. And through his gift, he transformed not only himself, but everyone around him. As the scene closes, the boy sits alone in his room. Sketches scattered across the desk. Letters of invitation from schools, art clubs, and organizations lie beside him. He lifts his pencil, looks out the window, and smiles. His journey is only beginning. The world, once deaf to his silence, was now waiting to listen. The world around him had changed. Once, his silence had been a prison, a cage built by other people's laughter, taunts, and cruel whispers. But now that same silence had become his crown. They bullied the silent boy because they thought he was empty. The narrator reflects. But his silence was not weakness, it was power. And when he finally spoke through his gift, the world listened. One afternoon, as he walked across the schoolyard, a group of former bullies stopped him. Their faces were red with shame, their voices trembling. "We're sorry," one of them muttered. "We didn't know," another added softly. The boy didn't answer with words. He simply nodded, his eyes calm as if to say, "You don't need to understand my silence anymore. You just need to respect it." It wasn't revenge he carried. It was something far greater, forgiveness born from strength. Soon his story spread far beyond the classroom. Parents whispered about him at the market. Neighbors shared his drawings as if they were treasures. Teachers spoke his name with pride. And quietly, without ever giving a speech, he became a teacher himself, not of subjects, but of humanity. The lesson was simple but unforgettable. Never underestimate someone because they are different. How many gifts have we missed simply because we chose to mock instead of understand? How many silent souls walk among us carrying something extraordinary that we are too blind to see? The story doesn't just belong to him anymore. It becomes a mirror, reflecting the cruelty of judgment and the beauty of patience. The boy sits at his desk one night, sketches covering the table. But now, alongside them lie letters, invitations from art schools, organizations, even competitions in other cities. He touches the papers gently, but his eyes drift not to the future, but back to the past. To the boy who once sat in the corner of the classroom, mocked and alone. That boy is gone. What remains is the young man he has become. Proof that silence can shape greatness. They thought he was broken. They thought he was strange. They thought his silence was emptiness. But they were wrong. His silence was full of dreams, full of strength, full of a gift the world would never forget. A pause. And now, the question is not about him anymore. It is about you. What hidden gift might you be carrying in silence? And when the world finally sees it, will they be ready to listen?